Hey everyone, we're going to pick up the story of the American Rebellion in the colonies in the summer of 1776. Last time we finished off talking about the Declaration of Independence. It's again written by the committee. Congress then on July 2nd votes through the individual colonies, and now we can call them the states. So each of the states vote, and with the 12 to 0 to 1 abstaining, it becomes what they call a unanimous declaration of the United States. So one of the first times we see that, of course, being used, that term. So after the vote, after the adoption of the Declaration, now this army gathering around first in Philadelphia and now on the move, commanded by George Washington, has a cause. Now we're moving from the American Rebellion to, we might say, the American Revolution or the Revolutionary War. The revolution was happening up until this point. Now we see the military part of this part of our history. And a lot of people like to ask that question, Washington, why isn't his name on the Declaration of Independence? And his simple answer is that he is not in Philadelphia to sign it. He had taken command the year before of the army that had gathered around Boston, Massachusetts, and they had one success in the beginning of 1776. Washington was able to secure all of the cannon that had been brought from Fort Ticonderoga. I mentioned that in the last class. British fort that was captured. The cannon were then moved overland, and in many cases they came on sleds because it was during the winter time, and brought to Washington's army in Boston. And the British literally woke up one morning and saw that their town that they occupied, they thought they were safe in Boston, was now surrounded by this Continental Army, which now had artillery, the ability to lob these shells into the city. And that becomes kind of a game changer for them. And the British decide to withdraw. They leave Boston early 1776, have a winter encampment, and then they're on the move again later that year. It is absolutely to no one's surprise that their goal, the British goal for later in 1776, is the most important port and the most important city in North America. This is, of course, New York. This is a map representing Manhattan Island and part of Long Island in 1776. And you can see from the map that the English have all of the advantages. They have the best navy in the world. They have one of the best armies in the world. So when Washington discovers, through people around the colonies, now the states, that the British are determined to move on New York, his question is, number one, should I defend the city? Should I fight, in other words, to keep the British out of New York? Secondly, where? That's the other big question. Washington really wants nothing to do with defending Manhattan Island and New York. And you can see why, just looking at the geography here. The British have, in other words, all of the advantages. He also knows that the city of New York has a pretty high population of loyalists, or Tories as we've been calling them. And that's important to consider. So Washington thought, why don't we just destroy the city? Let's get there first and burn it, and then the British won't get to use it. And the Congress said, no, we'd rather you not do that. And Washington, as I stated last time, he's taking orders from the Continental Congress, the Congress now sitting in session. And so he's going to carry out their wishes. So he has to defend a city that he doesn't want to defend with an army that's not quite ready to take on the British. The British are coming in large numbers. There's no doubt about that. They're also strengthening their force with soldiers from England being brought over on Navy ships. And they're also going to be using the Hessian mercenaries, those soldiers from the German states that are used to supplement or augment George III's forces in North America. And they are determined both the British and the Hessians, to surround and cut down, capture the Continental Army. Washington sets up his defenses on Long Island. We'll go back to the map. We'll use it a couple times today. Here's Long Island. This is where Washington decides to put the Continental Army. Not a good position when you think about it, because your back's to the water and few people can really swim that effectively or swim across the East River to get to Manhattan. But he thinks he has his troops positioned in a good spot. Turns out he's completely wrong, of course. The British attack in August of 1776. Washington was not able to keep his army protected from the different sides. The British found a way to go around his army, surround him, and push him all the way to the corner of Long Island. And they're literally set to finish him off when the British commander hesitates. I think maybe he's waiting to see if they can negotiate an end to this conflict. Who knows? I mean, the guy literally could have attacked and just pushed Washington's army literally into the East River. And so when that delay happens, Washington takes his whole army and retreats to Manhattan. So he gets all the boats he can find in Lower Manhattan and on Long Island and floats his army from Long Island to Manhattan. And everyone's like, oh, yay, it's a great victory. And it's not really, because the army is slowly but surely disappearing. Washington maybe had 15, 16,000 soldiers, just to give you a scale of what we're talking about. Here's a better map. If we look at the greater New York area, you can see where the British have all the advantages. Here's Washington, where he got stuck on Long Island. The British moved from Staten Island to feed his army here. Washington floats them to Manhattan right here. But look at how you can maneuver if you have a navy. I mean, this is just a tailor-made situation for the English. Horrible for Washington. And what takes place next, people can see it before it even happens. His army lands in Manhattan, and they literally race up Manhattan Island, with the British pursuing them on the rivers, and also on several occasions almost trapping Washington's army on Manhattan, because all they have to do is land a force behind him, and it's game over. Washington's frustrated. He really wants to take on the British, show he is their equal, but his soldiers aren't quite there yet, especially not in 1776. And John Adams, of course, who has a lot of great things to say about the American Revolution, says in the New York campaign, this is what we call these battles, sets of battles in the summer of 1776. He says, in general, our generals were outgeneraled. And that's true. Washington's army crosses into New Jersey and then begins during the fall of 1776 to retreat across the state of New Jersey. And that's mapped out here. And we'll take a closer look at that, because you can see, if you pay attention to the lower part here, the upper part deals with a campaign the next year. So we're watching Washington fight the battles, Manhattan, Long Island, make his way up the Hudson River, and this direct line across the state of New Jersey, that tells you something. I mean, he hightails it across the state with the British hot on his heels during the later months of 1776. He doesn't stop until he crosses the Delaware River, and the Continental Army, probably under 5,000 soldiers. So the soldiers went home. They fought. Some of them said, yeah, we served for part of the war, we served for part of the campaigns, and we've had enough. Some of them are horrified by battle, what they see. Some of them are not used to the boredom and rigors of camp life, the training, the marching, being away from home, of course, all factor. So Washington puts his army, he thinks, safely in Pennsylvania for the winter of 1776. And a lot of people think it's basically over. Washington even writes back to family members in Virginia. He says, I think the game is pretty much near up. That's his prediction for the end of the year. But he also realized something else is happening. Even though his army size is dwindling, he knows that he has enough soldiers and will have enough soldiers just until the end of the year, just until the end of 1776. Many of his soldiers signed up for just the year. So that means on December 31st, they're going to go home. And if he can only plan something very bold to give the cause, the American rebellion, cause to believe that they were going to have a chance to win, it would make all the difference in the world. And in these days that seem very gloomy, it's Thomas Paine who wrote Common Sense earlier in the year, writes another pamphlet. It's The American Crisis. Paine's, again, you can see it right here in this original, The American Crisis, by the author of Common Sense. In case you didn't know, in case you were someone who actually didn't know who wrote Common Sense, it was so well known earlier in the year, provoking both the people to support and then, of course, the colonies and states to vote for independence. Well, it's Paine in The American Crisis who says, "These are the times that try men's souls. The sunshine soldier and the patriots, in other words, will in this crisis fail." In other words, he's predicting what Washington had already, or he's talking about what Washington already knew, that when things look good, there's a lot of enthusiasm for support of the Continental Army. And then when things go bad, Washington asks, where are all those soldiers who came out in support after Lexington and Concord? Well, they're gone. They're gone. But you have to have some good news so you can recruit an army for the next year and continue the American Rebellion. Now that the army has a cause, it's independence, but it's not looking too good. So realizing that the army is about to literally go back home at the end of the month, he's now in December 1776. He has maybe 3,000 soldiers, but more importantly, he has them only for a given amount of time. The British, meanwhile, this is where Washington senses an opportunity. The British, after chasing Washington across New Jersey, make a couple decisions. First, they're going to keep their army quartered or wintered in New York City. So they're going to have their soldiers stay in Manhattan. And it's good for them. I mean, no self-respecting army fights in wintertime. It's cold, it's windy, the guns don't work as well. So you occupy New York. New York is the home of a significant population of loyalists. Seems to make sense. Washington, look, he's done for. We're hearing reports from our loyalists in New Jersey that it's all done with. So they keep their main army in New York and they station throughout New Jersey. Different posts or towns are fortified by either the British or the Hessians. One particular town is right across the river. You can see where the arrow is on the map. Washington's army is on this side of the Delaware in Pennsylvania. There's a group of Hessian soldiers at Trenton, the future capital of the state of New Jersey, just a small village in the end of 1776. Washington knows that people within New Jersey continue to keep the cause alive. The British are having difficulty communicating between their outposts, supplying their army in New York. So he thinks, wow, we've not been defeated. We've not been pacified. The British are trying to do that, but it hadn't been successful. So he decides to lead a bold attack against, in this particular case, the Hessians, the soldiers in Trenton. This is the fabled painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. It's a great, great piece of Americana. Unfortunately, if you loaded that many guys into that boat, it would sink. This was painted by a German artist, and he used the Rhine River in Germany as his inspiration. It didn't look a lot like the Delaware, though. So someone also would have probably hollered at Washington to sit his behind down before he fell in the water too and quickly sank. This is a little bit more accurate. See the boats, how different they are? These are rowboats. These are Durham boats that are used to carry grain. And you can see what they did. They would secure one riverbank on the other side, the Pennsylvania side, to the New Jersey side. And you can see that it was cold, it was snowy, bitter cold. Washington is pictured here. This is more accurate of the crossing of the Delaware River. There was ice, but there wasn't giant chunks of ice like icebergs, which you see here. And they crossed the river in several columns in Christmas night, 1776. And they caught the Hessians in Trenton by surprise. There's stories that they were completely hungover. It was Christmas morning. They had too much to drink. That's not the case. It was more about the surprise. You can see several of the Hessians wounded here as the soldiers move in and begin to close off the Hessians' escape out of Trenton. One road within the town of Trenton was secured and a group of Hessians captured because a very young New Yorker who had been born in the Caribbean named Alexander Hamilton had commanded American artillery cannons at the battle, and that had helped turn the tide. So Washington has this, at the time, significant victory, the capture of Trenton, Christmas 1776. The next day, he decides to recross the river, stay in Pennsylvania, and then try once again to recruit an army. He agrees to have some of the soldiers stay on well into 1777, and that's a good thing. He gets some congressmen to get money. He pays some of the soldiers in the army by coin to stay for a little bit longer, and then Washington decides to attack another British army near the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University. And so Washington has another battle with elements of the British Army near Princeton. So it's a 1-2 punch, very successful. And then Washington takes his army, not in Pennsylvania, but they actually cross into northern New Jersey in an area up here near Morristown. So you're close to the British. And now you can try, after this big morale boost, I mean, Congress is getting worried. The army had been basically depleted. And the British thought, well, next year we'll just finish him off. But that wasn't the case at all. He's able to recruit another force and take the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, into a second year. Now, taking a break from the military campaigns for a minute, we'll talk a little bit about what John Adams always thought was the most significant part of the American Revolution. Yes, the Declaration is significant. Yes, the fighting that takes place, it has to go well for the American cause, or else there is no United States. But John Adams thought the revolution, the real revolution, happened within the different states or the former colonies at a local level. Adams said that when you overthrow royal authority, first the Congress did it by breaking from Great Britain, declaring themselves independent. The other thing that happened is that these states, remember, used to be colonies, the colony of New York, the colony of Massachusetts. What happens is when these colonies become independent, they are states, and the Congress tells these different states it's time to write new state constitutions. Just like the government at the central level would have a constitution written during the Revolution, the states would be the same. And we mention this in some detail because of the theme in these state constitutions. Remember what the colonists had experienced in the 1760s and 70s. They completely rejected and distrusted power that was centralized in the form of Parliament, London, the royal governors, the council for the royal governors in the different colonies. So we might say and agree with John Adams that the spirit of the revolution, the spirit of the rebellion, is to reject this centralized authority. And we see a reinvention in how the colonies and now the states began to conduct themselves. More offices in the different states are elected, not appointed, where a royal governor or royal official would choose the person to become a judge or an official within that colony. But now more of them are up to the direct election of the people. In some cases, the governor was chosen by the legislature or the governor was popularly elected. This is far different from in the old colonial ways of the crown, the king or queen, appointing a governor and the royal governors. So this is a dramatic change, and Adams was right. Some colonies, and we are very used to our current model of how things are done. Congress tells the states to do something, then they do it. One size fits all. But Congress simply said to the states, look, write new state constitutions. They didn't give them a blueprint or specific guidance. And as a result of that, you have states like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania doesn't even have an office of governor. And John Adams says Pennsylvania, in a few years, they're going to beg to come back under the control of Great Britain. No governor, no executive branch. That's crazy. That's crazy. But we can understand from the colonist point of view why things developed this way. If you lived through the 1760s or 1770s, you can understand it. No abuse of power, no concentrated authority. Make a lot of the terms of office very short. Term limit. Ooh, there's a fascinating idea, right? Limit how long politicians can stay in office. Make their terms short. Some governors are 2 years, 1 year, even for some particular states. That way you cannot collect and abuse power. The Declaration said government is a foreign entity. You choose to create a government, because without one, there'd be chaos. And so you give up some of your rights to enter into a society. But there are laws. Well, you don't want those laws, and you don't want power to be concentrated into one area. So that's why Adams thought this was very important, what was taking place in 1776 and 1777. The states, unfortunately, didn't change a lot of their requirements for voting. It still meant the old colonial rule for male property owners, not women. Although, with one exception, the state of New Jersey allowed women to vote because the Constitution of New Jersey said property owners. And they didn't mention any gender designation. And women, for about 2 decades in New Jersey, who qualified for property and owned it on their own, could vote until they changed the Constitution. And certainly there was an expectation that the revolution would bring about significant change. And in this area, the area of constitution writing at the state level, we do see a lot happening. We also see that spirit, the spirit of the revolution, take place and be acknowledged at the national level. At the national level, the first government of the United States, the first Constitution of the United States, was written in the middle of the war, and it was called the Articles of Confederation. It's our first national constitution. Now, it didn't last very long, under 10 years, but I think it's important to evaluate because it truly speaks to the mood of the nation during the American Revolution. This Congress created under the Articles of Confederation, has few powers. We would call them enumerated, spelled out, discussed, enumerated powers. And they're given just a few. They run the war. That's what Congress was going to do. They conducted foreign affairs. At the moment that the Articles of Confederation was written, several Americans, including Benjamin Franklin, were talking to other countries, especially France, to try to get aid, military aid, the Navy, a foreign alliance. That would be even better. And third major category that could be controlled by Congress was the Indian trade. Most Native Americans in the American Revolution, with just a couple of exceptions, fight on the side of the British. No surprise. The British had tried to keep the colonists and Indians separate, knowing that sometimes there were violent episodes. Look at Pontiac's Rebellion. So now the British can say effectively, if these American independence-minded people get their way, it's going to be bad news for you, the Indians. And they were right. So we'll talk a little bit more about the Articles of Confederation. It creates one branch of government, the Congress. There is no executive branch, what we call the president. Sometimes you'll hear references to the president. They mean the president of Congress. And they don't have any extra power than any other congressman. So there is no office of president. There is no judiciary or court system. So we are used to three branches of government in our modern system. The Congress during the war had one, the Congress. And what Congress could do was very limited. The ability of congressmen to serve, or their desire to serve, was also compromised on purpose. Congressmen are term limited under the Articles of Confederation. You can only serve so many years in a given period. That way you had a lot of turnover. That's what they wanted. Congress, I kid you not, they ask for requisitions of the states for things like taxes and the number of soldiers that will be sent to the Continental Army. Ask for taxes. And of course, since you have no executive branch, you have no enforcement measures. And so it doesn't work very well. Decisions in Congress, when you voted on matters before the Congress, you needed the approval of 9 of the 13 states. That's an overwhelming support. Again, that avoids tyranny, avoids any collection of power in one place. If 9 states, what would be a majority of 13? 6.5, 7? So 9, make 9, and you have a really strong support for something. Now, when you go to amend or change the articles, you need the approval of all the states. One example that came up a couple times during the war is that Congress contemplated putting a tax on imports. We would call it a tariff. They call it an impost back then, tax on imports. Well, that's one of those things that requires an amendment. And so a couple times they had enough, almost enough states to support it. And one time they had 12 supporting. So if you have 12 for and 1 against, it won't pass. But this is exactly the way the colonists wanted. Congressmen wanted it. The congressmen that draft the Articles of Confederation wanted. You have to have overwhelming consensus or support to get any change. If that isn't the case, what is the revolution all about? You want to make sure that you don't replace British tyranny with American tyranny. And so that sentiment from that produces what takes place first in the states and secondly in the national level with the Articles of Confederation. All right. So what happens in the aftermath of Washington's victory at Trenton and Princeton? Notes that I thought I have, I'm pulling up right now. 1777, the second year of the American Revolution, the year of the hangman because of the 3 sevens. The British unveil a new strategy by which they're going to end the rebellion. It's pretty bold, and it seems to be and work very well. British strategy, very simple in 1777. First, they're going to take an army out of Canada, make their way down through the Hudson River Valley in between what's now Vermont and New York, make their way south, and that way they can cut off and isolate all of New England, because I've said several times, they think this is a New England rebellion, and they're wrong. That's part one of their strategy. Their second part is to leave New York. You can see it on this map here. Make their way on the British Navy up the Chesapeake Bay and capture the American capital of Philadelphia, which they expect to happen in the summer or fall of 1776. Washington gets wind of what's happening, And not surprisingly, he feels he has to challenge the British move against Philadelphia. Washington fights 2 battles near Philadelphia, loses both of them. But he has a couple of conclusions after these defeats on the military battlefield, the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. So once again, the British Army enters a major American city. The rebellion, is it going to continue or not? That's unknown after these 2 losses. And people are beginning to talk in 1777 about Washington's ability as a commander. Is this guy going to be able to get things done? There's something of a whisper campaign in Congress, if you can believe this, because he's such a legend and American icon now, of really replacing Washington with someone else. But Washington, as far as the strategy goes, and this is where on the battlefield he's not a great general. But when you talk about the big picture, there are a few better than Washington. Because after his 2 losses and the British marching into Philadelphia, so they've occupied New York, now they occupy Philadelphia, and Washington has to find a winter encampment for the end of 1777. His 2 conclusions are, first, the Continental Army cannot fight toe-to-toe with the British, meaning that idea that we can train an army, train a European-style army, much like the British, maybe not. It looks like he'll never be able to instill them with the discipline and training needed to fight the same way. He's tried to draw up these elaborate battle plans in the battles around Philadelphia. They fail. But here's the other and more important conclusion that he makes. The Continental Army does not have to fight toe-to-toe with the British. For the rest of the Revolution, Washington says, here's the big strategy. We, the Continental Army, with me in charge, we will pick and choose where we fight the British. And that way, I guarantee that the army is never destroyed. For the revolution to survive, Washington says the army must survive. And so he's going to pick and choose where his battles will be against the British. And when he goes into battle, always have an escape plan, always have a plan that doesn't risk losing the army. Because it seems now the American people are kind of lackluster in supporting the war. The Congress isn't helping much. There seems to be talk, but no real concrete proof that any foreign power will give aid. So the army, if the army's around, the British will have to continue to fight. So if you destroy the army, the revolution's over. It's a very effective, long-range goal. This is seeing the big picture. Draw it out. Reinforce the British that you have a 3,000-mile supply line. Do you really want to continue doing this? And it's a great strategy at the end. The war, and this is why there is talk of replacing replacing Washington. We'll go back to the map very quickly because this is important for the overall course of the American Revolution. The British do march out of Canada. They seem to have a great amount of success going south along the Hudson River, and they face a different Continental Army, one commanded by General Gates and with the later famous traitor Benedict Arnold. The British seem to be completing their war aims, capturing Philadelphia, and now moving south towards Albany. And this is going to be a game changer if they're able to be successful. Unfortunately, in a couple of battles that happened near the New York town of Saratoga, the British end up surrendering an entire army to General Gates and Benedict Arnold. In fact, he's one of the more he's one of the reasons why Benedict Arnold, believe it or not, he was part of that critical victory in 1777. In the aftermath of the Battle of Saratoga, this is a turning point in the war, the Saratoga Battle in the fall of 1777, when its news is carried across the Atlantic about Gates and Arnold's victory there, the French decide they're going to have a formal alliance with the United States. The work that had been done by several American diplomats, including Benjamin Franklin, here he is. The French call him l'ambassadeur, the ambassadeur électrique, the electric ambassador for his experiments with kite flying and creation of some of the scientific innovations he came up with. So Franklin plays up the role of the simple bumpkin colonist, but he's very skilled at bringing in the French in first military aid, uniforms, supplies, guns. American Continental Army carries French muskets. And then later, at the end of 1777, the announcement of a formal alliance. And the Americans are pretty bold, Franklin included. They tell the French that, look, you're going to fight with us until the very end, until we win our independence. You can't make a separate peace with the English. You're going to war with England. The other development of the French alliance, which goes into effect in 1778, is that the English now have to treat this colonial rebellion, this American Revolution, as more of a world war. There is no threat, the British realize, from the Continental Army to land in London and invade England. There is no Continental Navy. I mean, Congress tries to come up with one, but again, it's never going to threaten the English. But when the French enter, that is an absolute game changer. So this is why the British begin to change their strategy. Washington, meanwhile, endures a very harsh winter in 1777 and 1778. This is the fabled Valley Forge encampment, where you hear about the bloody footprints in the snow, how much snow there was, and how the army almost froze. These are recreated cabins at Valley Forge National Military Park outside of Philadelphia. So Washington had not been able to keep the British from occupying the American city. Congress hightails it out of Philadelphia. They go into the Pennsylvania countryside and continue to meet in different places in the American states for the remainder of the war. And it's uncertain whether Washington, who takes his army into the Valley Forge encampment, is going to come out of it alive. The supply system from the Continental Army is atrocious. His army is also suffering from smallpox. This is a reenactor. This guy's okay, don't worry. Who's you can show what smallpox can do. It can debilitate your whole army. He's also hoping at Valley Forge to get some necessary additional training for the Continental Army. And then, of course, there's concern about whether the French alliance is actually going to help turn the tide. The British, when they evaluate what takes place after the French alliance, they're not surprisingly, they say, okay, what is this going to mean for us as far as not just against our former colonies, but what about the way we look at the war, new campaigns we open up, and protecting not just the American colonies, but other colonies around the world. That's why 1778 is a game changer. This is why the English take on new strategies. Washington, by that point, has decided, I'm going to fight the war differently. I'm just going to keep hanging on. But he's desperately trying to keep his army intact and alive at Valley Forge. If he's going to initiate this new strategy, never let the Continental Army get destroyed. And of course, what's going to be the role of the French? Is this just talk, or is there going to be a significant aid with the Army and the Navy? And that's the story we'll pick up when we continue next time.